Introduce first Rebecca Jarman, our panel chair. Rebecca's a lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds and has a very wide range of interests, including film, and is very interested, obviously, in Peru as well. And yeah, I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just going to hand over to you, Rebecca. I just wanted to introduce you.
Thanks, Steph. It gets very meta with the introductions, doesn't it? Because I'm now going to introduce Marcelo Ikeda. He's going to be giving a paper called Garage Cinema and New Film Criticism, Intersections in Contemporary Brazilian Cinema. Marcelo is joining us today from the Universidade Federal do Ceará, or thereabouts, and I apologise in advance for my awful Portuguese pronunciation. He's a lecturer in film and audiovisual culture there and has authored several books, including Cinema de Garagem, Leis de Incentivo para o Audiovisual, and Fissuras e Fronteiras. So over to you, Marcelo, and will we then be going straight to Sarah, or are we doing questions afterwards? Straight to Sarah, and we'll take questions afterwards. There are Q&A possibilities in the chat, so you can put your questions there, or I assume raise your hand and ask them yourself at the end. So over to you, Marcelo.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon to the European viewers. Here in Brazil, I'm talking in Fortaleza, Ceará. It's in the northeast of Brazil, near Pernambuco. So here is good morning. Here is 9:15. It's early morning. And thanks to Stephanie for the invitation to be part of this seminar. I'm very glad to be here. Unfortunately, we are not in Leeds. Last year, I was living in London, making a part of my PhD research in University of Reading, supervised by Professor Lucia Najib. But now I'm back in Brazil. And as you know, Brazil is facing a terrible moment because of COVID, with more than 4,000 deaths a day, 4,000 deaths a day. And perhaps in the Q&A, Brazilian film critic Pablo Vilaça will talk a bit more about how is Brazil now and how is Brazilian cinema. Brazilian film agency, Ancine, the national film agency in Brazil, stopped supporting Brazilian films since the beginning of Bolsonaro government in 2019, so much before the COVID. So we are facing, unfortunately, a terrible moment. But anyway, this is not the aim of my presentation. I'm going to talk about a new generation of filmmakers in Brazilian cinema from the mid-2000s onwards, which I call garage cinema. Stimulated by digital technologies, this generation from different cities in the country, especially apart from Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, the two main economic cities in Brazil, this generation started making very low budget films. The budgets were about $100,000 and usually organized by film collectives in an alternative mode of production in relation to the basis of Brazilian film industry, which was based on public tax incentives, the main source of financing for Brazilian feature films during the last decade. And these films started to be selected to important international film festivals, such as Rotterdam, Locarno, and even Berlin, Berlinale, Venice, Cannes, such as O Céu sobre os Ombros, The Sky Above by Sérgio Borges, in Rotterdam, 2010, Felipe Bragança and Marina Meliandi, A Alegria, The Joy, in Cannes, 2010, Elvésio Marins and Clarissa Campolina's Girimunho, Swirl, it's a difficult word to pronounce, Swirl, in Venice, Horizonte, 2011, Marcelo Pedroso, Brasil S.A., Brazilian Dream, in Berlinale, Forum, 2014, Ventos de Agosto, August Winds, by Gabriel Mascaro, in Locarno, 2014, Another film in Locarno 2014 is Com os Punhos Cerrados, Clenched Fists, by the film collective Alumbramento. Alumbramento is like enchantment, the film collective in Ceará, among many others. So I'm going to talk about how film criticism could influence a new generation of filmmakers during the 2000 on. And this lecture is part of my PhD thesis, which analyzes how this generation of filmmakers gained legitimacy within the field of Brazilian cinema. So I mean, how some artists considered outsiders, how they started to be recognized as a distinctive, innovative force in Brazilian cinema. So I consider the role of new concepts in film criticism and the network of the film festivals, which supported the new values presented by this new generation of filmmakers. But well, about film criticism, I would like to start saying that it's important to understand the transformation of film criticism in Brazil with the internet from the end of 1990s, with the contribution of a generation of new critics, new film critics, who created websites and blogs on the internet that expressed other ways of writing and included other films when compared to the main vehicles of the press in that period. Film criticism in the mainstream media outlets, especially the more traditional daily newspapers like O Globo, Folha de São Paulo, Estado de São Paulo, was in the late 90s in a crisis that affected journalism in a broader sense. Specialized film criticism was transformed in a kind of a cultural journalism, which was interested in the entertainment industry, focused on news, star system, shows, what is fun to do in the weekends, these like of things. So reducing the analysis, the potential of analysis, considering film just as an entertainment. So beyond this, the chain of commercial theaters in Brazil, they also underwent a major transformation with the closing of art house cinemas and the construction of multiplexes, especially in shopping centers during the 1990s. So in Brazil, there are few art house cinemas, and these ones are generally supported by local funds in main cities, in the main cities and capitals. Many of the most important contemporary filmmakers were not screened in Brazilian commercial theaters. So, for example, Claire Denis, Beau Travail, Dardenne Brothers, Rosetta, Platform by G. Zanke, In Wanda's Room, Pedro Costa, Werkmeister Harmonies by Bellatar, Hu Shaoxen, Gary by Gus Van Sant, Rapon by Carlos Reigada, Shara, Naomi Kawase, Los Muertos, Lisandro Alonso, Tropical Malady, Apisha Pong Veracetaku, films from by Lav Diaz and Raya Martin, the Philippine films, Albert Serra, among many others. These films were not screened in commercial theaters in Brazil. And film critics in the most traditional Brazilian newspapers, they only wrote about films released in these commercial theaters. So these films were generally ignored by Brazilian film critics and so by Brazilian audience. These films were only screened in film festivals, especially in Festival do Rio, Rio Film Festival, and Mostra de São Paulo International Film Festival, the two huge international film festivals in the two main economic cities in Brazil that offered a wide panorama of world film production. But these films had only 1 or 2 film screenings in these festivals, and afterwards they were not released in commercial theaters. So the importance of film, this new generation of film criticism in the internet started with the coverage of these 2 film festivals, because this young generation of film critics could focus on films which gained no attention in the newspaper most traditional film critics. So I am part of this young film critic generation some years ago, and I remember when we saw films like Shara, Naomi Kawase's Shara, Blissfully Yours by Apichat Pong, In Vanda's Room, Pedro Costa, which caused a huge impact on us. And we sat on the first rows of the screening room, and we looked at each other, and we saw there are no newspaper film critics, because they were interested in films like Pedro Almodóvar, Lars von Trier, Ken Loach, Ulrich Seidel films, auteurs, directors, but most commercial auteurs, filmmakers. So in Brazil, there were 2 important film websites. So in the internet websites, Contracampo, like Reverse Shot, and Cinetic. So the critics were young film students with just finished university, but they offered new methods in comparison to newspaper coverage of these festivals. So thanks to these websites, debates on contemporary cinema were not restricted just in the main commercial auteurs like Almodóvar, Von Trier, Tarantino, etc. But they expanded the way the audience could view contemporary cinema. But the problem is that Festival do Rio or Mostra de São Paulo, they are 2 film festivals during 2 or 3 weeks based in Rio and São Paulo. So, for example, if a film critic who lived in Fortaleza, if he or she wanted to see these films, he or she had to travel the country and stay for 2 or 3 weeks in the cities. So it would be very difficult for a young film critic to do like this. So the internet, downloading films, especially in peer-to-peer technologies like torrent, if it's not the ideal way of seeing these films, was the only way that film critics, this new generation of film critics outside Rio and São Paulo, could see the most important films in contemporary cinema. So I would like to give 2 examples of how these transformations of film criticism influenced a new generation of filmmakers. Reading these new websites, young filmmakers realized there was something new in contemporary cinema, which has no screenings in local cinemas, and local newspapers and magazines did not talk about this. They started to search these films in the internet. So because of this, for example, o coletivo Alumbramento, a film collective, Alumbramento Enchantment in Ceará, one of the most representative film collectives of this new generation of filmmakers, they shot a short film called Longa Vida ao Cinema Cearense, Long Live Cinema from Ceará, in 2009. This short film was directly influenced by Raya Martin's short film called Long Live Philippine Cinema. So these filmmakers from Ceará, they had access to the films of this Philippine filmmaker through the internet, as in that time, his films had never been screened in Brazil, not even in special screenings in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and these 2 film festivals. So this is an example how these transformations in film criticism has produced an impact on the films of the generation of the Brazilian filmmakers. Another example is A Floresta de Jonatas, do Sérgio Andrade, Jonatas Forest, screened in the Berlinale 2012. Sérgio de Andrade is from Amazon, from Amazon. So this is the first film from Amazon, directed by an Amazonian filmmaker. It's not a film just shot in Amazon, but it's a film by an Amazonian filmmaker. So it's the first film by an Amazonian filmmaker in more than 20 years. And this film was clearly influenced by tropical malady, by Apichatpong. And in Amazon, there are no art house theaters, just multiplexes. So this filmmaker could see this film thanks to the internet. So it's very interesting how the internet and film criticism helped to create a link on two so different and distant places, such as Fortaleza and Philippines, in Raya Martin influence, or Amazon and Thailand in the second case. So I used to make a joke that these films showed that Thailand or Philippines were closer to Fortaleza or Amazon than Rio and São Paulo. So the internet brought different film criticism, helped to bring another ways of cinephilia, another habits of seeing films, opening the scenario for other films that were not covered in traditional film criticism. And this made an impact on young Brazilian filmmakers that started to realize there are many more films beyond the coverage of mainstream film criticism, and independent film criticism and independent filmmakers in Brazil started to make a link. So that's it. It's my presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Really interesting and unusual connections there, which I look forward to discussing in a moment. Before we do that, I'll pass over to Sarah for the next presentation. She's going to be talking about online film criticism in Peru, democratizing or polarizing the national. Sarah joins us today from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, where she is professor in film and media. Her research focuses on the relationship between cinema, state, society, and violence in Peru, with an emphasis on diversity. Her monograph on Peruvian cinema and the Shining Path was published in 2018, and a co-edited volume of essays on the 21st century Peruvian cinema will be published by Palgrave in 2021. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you, Marcelo, for that lovely presentation. It was really brilliant to hear about filmmaking from and criticism on the Amazon, which is so necessary. So thank you. Alice is driving this presentation. I'm really grateful to you. So forgive me if I'm doing the move slide now, or please could you move to the next one that we're so familiar with in UK culture right now. I assume you can hear me okay, Rebecca? Just want to check. Great, good. Before we get started. Now, in an earlier presentation, Sergio, talking about Portuguese film criticism, sort of said that Portugal didn't have a great tradition of film criticism, but it does have a wonderful tradition of film generally. In Peru, there has been a really strong culture of film criticism. And so I am going to try and just give you a little flavor of this and show, I guess, a few of the sort of the turns and inflections of most recent times. But it is a very complex picture. It's a very strong picture. And I'm going to try and do it through two of the particular characters, two of the film critics. And by the end of the presentation, I'm kind of going to point to a notion of film critic as activist as a bit of a paradigm here. So my presentation is kind of really talking about sort of where and what is the national. I'm not really sure. Having spent many years thinking about the national in terms of Peru, I have no idea where that is anymore. I think of course, it's incredibly complicated. And as we come up to a weekend of elections, presidential and congressional in Peru, it's just as complicated as ever. And film criticism is really at the heart of this. In many ways, it seems that the internet has facilitated an opening up and democratization of film criticism, with benefits, of course, for audiences, scholars, students, and enthusiasts. And yet, in other ways, we might argue that the somewhat privileged bubble of film criticism has narrowed even further, and that what the internet really provides for is greater visibility of the structures of power that frame film culture. Take the case of Peru, where the art of writing about film has been so important for the development of cinema culture since the 1960s, and has long been dominated by an auteur-driven perspective, heavily informed by the success and influence of the writers of journals such as Hablemos de Cine, which in 2015 celebrated the 50th anniversary of its launch. Could we have the next slide, please? One of its key writers, Ricardo Vedoya, of course they're on the left, continued the legacy of that publication with the follow-up, La Gran Ilusión. I'll say a bit more about these publications in a minute, which in turn has spawned an influential blog, which Vedoya edits, and a mainstream TV program, which he presents. So what I want to kind of show is his transition from the analog to the digital. These projects and others like them have provoked some debate about an ongoing lack of diversification, especially from those filmmakers and critics who felt rather marginalized from the patriarchal, Lima-centric initiatives that have developed through a national cinema for Peru. It might be argued that this somewhat elitist situation has tended to stifle perspectives about what is and isn't acceptable to represent the nation on global cinema circuits. For example, what can be, what might be, what becomes Peru's entry to the Goyas or the Academy Awards. One high-profile proponent of the argument for diversification of film criticism of Peru is Mónica Delgado, on the right here, who's worked as a critic since the late 1990s. Amongst her activities, she runs a bilingual online specialist film magazine, Desist Film, collaborates with and promotes a range of national and international publications that emphasize innovation and new voices, and has been invited to join jury panels on the global festival circuit. She's a prolific poster. Wasn't quite sure what the word should be there, but a poster to social media. She's very prolific on social media, and mainly via Facebook, which is very popular in Peruvian circles, carving out a role as activist on behalf of women's and marginalized cinemas of Peru and Latin America more broadly. So what I'd like to do in this brief presentation is to explore some of the tensions that dominate contemporary film criticism in Peru that does have, as I say, that deep, very rich history. What it means for the relationship between criticism, policy, filmmaking, and national identity formation in Peru, which is ridiculously ambitious. And of course, I'm not going to do that in any great detail, but just try to show some of the links between those areas and give some idea of the importance of film criticism in amongst those debates. And in particular, show what this, I hope, might mean for issues of diversity and marginalization. So I want to do this through the prism of the work and approaches of both Vedoya and Delgado. So could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in many respects, Ricardo Vedoya's career trajectory in film criticism is bound up with the history of Peruvian cinema itself, and one might say more broadly with the national politics of his time, although Vedoya has deliberately eschewed politicization and talking about politics. Perhaps not surprising given that his work came through at the time of political terrorism, of political armed conflict, different words for describing this, but a very difficult time for Peru of the 80s and 90s. So his writing about film, he kept very much to film and continues to do so. He trained in law and more recently in visual anthropology, and has been a prominent film critic and scholar in Peru since 1973, when he joined the core team of the groundbreaking film magazine. If I might just move to the next slide, please. Hablemos de Cine, which published 20 editions between 1965 and 1985. He went on to become one of the founding editors of its successor, La Gran Ilusión, with editions between 1993 and 2003, both of which were published in print format by the Universidad de Lima. He's now the lead film critic for daily national newspaper El Comercio, and since 2000, he's also directed the TV film program El Placer de los Ojos. He now also runs the blog page Páginas del Diario de Satán. If we could move to the next slide, please. He's professor, oh, sorry, that's the El Placer. If we could then, if I might just linger on this one for a second, though, just to note that he presents this program on TV Peru, which is one of the more mainstream cinema programs, Saturdays 11 p.m. It's a kind of mainstream program. And there've been several debates very recently. He's been running it for 20 years. And just recently, there've been kind of a few controversies around, for example, the fact that he did submit his resignation from the program back in November because of a particular political situation. So having spent many years of his time focusing on cinema, in the last 6 months or so, there has been a little kind of direct intervention into the politics of the nation. So if we could just move to the next slide, please. So he now also runs this blog, Páginas del Diario de Satán. He's also a professor at the Communication School of Universidad de Lima and has published several influential books on the history of cinema in Peru. And he's even appeared as the main cinema expert in a recent landmark film about the history of Peru through film, La Revolución y la Tierra. As such, his voice and his opinions are everywhere. Could we just move to that next slide, please? Thank you. And his impact and influence, not only on the history of Peruvian cinema, but on the way that cinema generally should be evaluated, really shouldn't be underestimated. Over nearly 50 years, he's offered to Peruvians a way of seeing cinema that for a long time was kind of hardly disputed. Of course, some aggravation or some comeback, some different voices, but his has really been very influential in a very informed, very articulate way. In fact, was largely venerated by filmmakers, scholars, festival programmers, and audiences. Through the circulation of his work to Spanish-speaking readers worldwide, he's provided a certain, perhaps hierarchical framing of Peruvian cinema for those interested in knowing about the films of this nation. And I should say that this paper is by no means a denigration of Ricardo Vedoya's work, who has been an absolute trailblazer of what he does. What I'm trying to do here in this paper is just point out how his voice has been so influential, and there are other voices now coming through that really, I think, show or reflect on the diversification of cinema in Peru itself. So reflecting on this trajectory in his own groundbreaking book, if we can move to the next slide, Writing National Cinema, Film Journals and Film Culture in Peru, published in 2009, Geoffrey Middens investigates the historical place of cultural writing within a national discourse by tracing how Peruvian cinema was shaped by local film criticism. Middens focuses on the 20-year history of Hablemos de Cine, alongside that of Peruvian filmmaking and film culture more broadly. He notes the similarity between Hablemos and the influential French journal, Cahiers du Cinéma. Both were founded by a group of young critics interested in claiming the director's use of mise en scène as the exclusive method of film analysis, rather than thematic, contextual, political, or star-oriented topics. Hence the title of the publication, derived from the battle cry of these critics at post-screening discussions. Let's just talk about film, they would say. The critical authority of the Hablemos critics grew along with the rise of local filmmaking and the nationalist fervour of the late 60s and early 70s. When state-led incentives spurred filmmaking in Peru in the mid-70s, the critics' perspective turned away from the politically militant readings that characterised most writing and film from the rest of Latin America at the time. Middens thus argues that by the 1980s, the critics at Hablemos de Cine had helped to engender a more audience-friendly, genre-influenced cinematic vision, best exemplified by the Peruvian auteur Francisco Lombardi, with his crime thrillers and dramas, and stimulated a unique, if somewhat isolating, national identity through film. And I'm aware that I'm kind of blending the auteur/genre sort of paradigm there very deliberately, because it sort of fits with what was going on with Lombardi's work at the time. If we may move to the next slide, please. The success of Hablemos de Cine, La Gran Ilusión, followed in this vein until the early 21st century, with its final edition, as shown here, number 13, published in 2003, focused on, it's not possible to see, and I don't think in the little tiny writing there, but what it does, it focused on what its critics considered to be the best Latin American films and the best Latin American directors of all time, which is quite some claim. Given the authority of these directors, their influence on the shaping of a Peruvian imaginary, and their quite specific auteur/genre approach to the evaluation of cinema, it's perhaps no wonder that filmmakers whose work embodies different approaches have felt perhaps a little left out. Given also that Vedoya and many of his contemporaries have also been influential, indirectly via their commentaries and also directly through membership of selection panels and juries in terms of the awarding of prizes and funding, in a context where financial support is extremely limited and competitive, and the idea of prestige has become highly contentious. It's also no wonder that some of this aggravation has become a little heated. Until recently, however, those aggravated parties have perhaps not been particularly well organised or well galvanised, i.e. they haven't perhaps been able to gain traction and voice with any rival new publication or anything that's kind of broken through the very local. And they haven't really mobilised, I would argue, social media to any great extent. That is until the arrival of, or the breaking into the scene, because as I said before, she's been around, of course, working since the late 90s, Monica Delgado, an outspoken critic, aligning her work with current debates and activism in feminism in particular, who's committed herself to shining a light on a diverse cinema culture in and of Peru and Latin America. If we might just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what I want to kind of argue here is that Monica Delgado has brought about through her work, through her presence, through her interventions, a very distinctive and kind of galvanized manifesto of resistance. And indeed, if you go to her website on her page, Desist Film, what we have there is a manifesto. She doesn't call it a manifesto of resistance, but this kind of phraseology comes up again and again. It began as a blog post in 2012. It's bilingual, which is different from the one by Ricardo Vedoya, and has sections on festivals, essay films, book and DVD reviews, Q&As, and a page on new filmmakers. I should say by bilingual, I mean in both Spanish and English. It also has a lively Facebook presence that does more than post links to specific pages on its website. It enters into and provokes debate. And again, that's somewhat different from Vedoya's site, which has lots of Facebook and Twitter presence, but it's mainly just driving you back to the blog site rather than provoking and entering into debate. Apologies for my slight distraction. I think I'm about to get cat bombed, but I think it's fine, so apologies. In January 2020, the two editors of this blog published a manifesto for their Desist Film project, which I'm going to read out here in English with some of the keywords on the slide that follows that caught my attention because I thought them to be most relevant to the purpose of this event when I was kind of going back through the kind of the key notions of what we should be doing here. So if I might ask to go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Alice. Oh, and the next one. Great. That's a quote is basically her very final line of, or their very final line of the manifesto, cinema that shelters us and makes us part of a better world. So that's where we're kind of heading really. Desist Film was born out of a vacuum, she said, seeking to counteract our weariness towards a local film criticism. And by local, she means kind of, the local national, with a shared agenda and linked to the commercial billboard. A vacuum that 8 years later continues to grow, despite the emergence of the democratization of information via the internet, which has allowed the most independent, experimental, risky political cinema to become visible and accessible outside the feud of a few. We confront this paradox in times where virtual platforms, programs, festivals, and the sometimes illicit distribution of the moving image have managed to lead us to a different cinema, despite it being seldom written about and commented on. In times of hyper-information, we continue to experience the phenomenon of invisibility of new directors and artists, of their new works, in a country where the protagonists remain the same as 20 years ago. We live in a country with more opportunities for access to cinema, but with few spaces for discussion and political evaluation, especially for new and young audiences. We started and we keep writing in the margins. In Desist Film, we propose a critique that seeks to break with the institutionalized logic of the traditional exhibition space that creates a stable and mediocre circuit, the prototype of a tired community. We criticize that which is presented as an act of permanent struggle to confront this monster of immense power that governs theatres with the same serial and ready-to-eat product, a monster that numbs brains, pens and podcasts, and that alienates the viewer's gaze amidst a culture of hyperactive consumption, which is part, unwittingly or not, of that vicious cycle that nobody wants to question. Desist Film proposes in some way to follow a different dialectic of production, distribution and exhibition of cinema, where the main figure of the filmmaker as the manager of their own work is paramount, a filmmaker as the architect of DIY, an often lonely entity, but with will and leadership to share their own poetics in this vital space that welcomes us. We're not a territorial magazine either. We were born in the Peruvian context, but when we opted for a non-profit publication, we did so with the desire of becoming a window that would bring films and filmmakers closer to the Peruvian audiovisual community. So a kind of a nod to, more than a nod, an actual transaction towards the transnational there, which is slowly coming out of its lethargy, she argues. Therefore, the commitment to publish in a bilingual format based on our interest with readers from other latitudes and their own interest in visualizing a Latin American Peruvian panorama based on information from local and regional publications is important, another type of transaction. Desist Film is not only a space of criticism, but also a living laboratory of thought and dialogue, of exposition and controversy, of rapprochement and creation of communities. Our commitment does not end with the digital text. It expands dimensions through workshops, local and international programs, conversations, curatorships, interviews, publications, and networking. If one kind of looks into this, even just in a cursory form, but certainly digging in deeper, all of that is genuinely happening. It's not just a kind of we will do, it is happening. Within the political atmosphere that renders the cult of individualism as synonym of progress, we insert ourselves into the system as an apparatus of resistance that anchors groups of people in orbit to the same passion, the moving image. We're encouraged by the commitment to continuing feeding this great community of criticism. We've no borders or nationalities, but what we do have and defend are filias and affiliations. We're encouraged by the influence of a Brakhage, a Darren, an Anglia, a Mekas or a Godard, as well as that of a Martel, a Rocha, an Ackerman, a Caldini or a Hirsch. It's interesting going back to our earlier conversation in the day that perhaps Orson Welles isn't mentioned, but those perhaps a little bit nod towards him are. We're also encouraged by a commitment to difference, of not following the simple string that's born of easy criticism, of the review of best film and best director, of the concession of indifference to the production systems that reproduce a class-based, sexist or elitist cinema. And they end, our bet is with the cinema that shelters us and makes us part of a better world. So a really, really, really bold commitment there, and one that needs to be tested, challenged, investigated, one that actually around the cult of personality, I think in particular needs to be challenged, given that there are really probably just one or two people who are taking this forward as critics at the moment. But what it does really represent is a commitment to diversification amongst critics, and the importance of critics in terms of diversifying cinema itself, in cinema in Peru and in the Andean sort of cultures more generally. So Delgado's approach has been contentious in that she doesn't shy away from being openly critical about those she considers not to be embracing this diversification of Peruvian cinema. Nevertheless, her work is certainly valued as high quality criticism, research-informed criticism, and she's developed different tools for understanding films, such as the video essay. Her own work and that of her magazine gives space to other films and filmmakers in Peru, especially women-led cinema. She seems to cope well with being at the centre of any social media storm and has become quite a well-known personality herself in the less mainstream cultural sphere of Peru, for her uncompromising approach to calling attention to any perceived instance of unfairness, privilege, or bias. It's also notable that her work includes educating and mentoring others, and that through Desi's film, she's offered a safe space for a host of new and diverse writers. Her role as critic activist has been clear from the start of her career. And I think I've got a final slide here, if you wouldn't mind going. Oh no, sorry. I had in my head a final slide, we'll stay there. And reinforced both by the manifesto as outlined and social media interventions that allege misogyny in the film festival arena and prejudice amongst festival jury, programming and funding panels in the Peruvian film system. Ricardo Vedoya, meanwhile, has kept deliberately kept his personal political views out of his film criticism work throughout his career for a variety of reasons, which are completely understandable, that include wanting to focus on the value of cinema in and of itself. Yet I would suggest that makes him no less committed to the culture, politics, and so on of his country. In sum then, to finalise, both Vedoya and Delgado have become synonymous with certain approaches to the writing of Peruvian and Latin American cinema. Both are committed to cinema as an art form bound up in the history, culture, and politics of Peru, the extra-textual activity of film culture. Both are activists in their own right, and I would finally contend that their role as critic activist in the Peruvian context of social division, social diversification, cultural crisis, and political turmoil is right now, on the eve of another potentially highly divisive presidential and congressional election, more important than ever. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. You've got some virtual clapping going on. So I was all rearing to go with my first question, but there's a question in the Q&A, so we'll jump straight to that. So this is from Donna Kirscher, and it's to Marcelo. And the question is piracy or illegal downloading part of the new values of film consumption or cinephilia?
Well, thanks for the question. It's important to say that the piracy in Brazil law, it's not illegal to download films. It's just illegal to sell and explore commercially these films. It's more or less the same logic by drugs. Drugs in Brazil, if you consume drugs, it's not illegal. What is illegal is to sell, is to profit economically for selling, for distributing drugs. So consuming films by the internet is not illegal. So what's illegal is to sell these films. And I think that the piracy is for third countries like Brazil, many times it's the only way to have access to these films, because the market, as I said, the commercial theaters, and there are no streaming channels that show these films. So internet, like this peer-to-peer technologies, was the only way to have access to these films. So it's an important way of democracy, of seeing other films, because markets, the economic constraints of markets, they have a short number of films. So it's not the ideal way, as I told you, it's not the ideal way, but it's the possibility to have access of these kinds of films. And it was important to develop other ways of shooting, other ways of talking about films. If it's not this way, these films would not be entered into a debate and the discussion in Brazil.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marcelo. Okay, well, while people are formulating their questions, then I'll go ahead and ask one. So it kind of links off the back of that question, actually. In both of the presentations, so Sarah and Marcelo kind of gestured towards the democratization of film criticism, and you kind of both hinted towards that partly some of this democratization stems from more dialogue between spectators and film critics, and the fact that dialogue has been enabled by the internet, basically, and by being able to kind of have the sorts of discussions that would normally take place, as Marcelo was saying, in the cinema, after the cinema, or as Sarah was saying, in Hablemos del Cine, you know, in these kind of closed fora. We now have this kind of a more open space where these kind of exchanges between filmmakers and spectators and critics and so on can take place in a more open and democratic fashion. And I wondered whether, in your opinion, that space online has been, I suppose, generated by the fact that more and more the experience of watching film is quite solitary. So whether you're downloading torrents illegally or legally, whether you're watching on a streaming platform and so on, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to have that kind of post-cinema drink or discussion. So is there something about the solitary experience of watching film that paradoxically generates a sense of community online that didn't necessarily exist before? Now, questions to both.
How do you go? I'm happy to say a couple of words, just of reflection, really. This is kind of just thoughts. I haven't done any kind of study on this, but what I have noticed is, of course, many more people commenting on and supporting each other's film, and supporting it in a way that's been different. So over the years in Peruvian film criticism, there has been quite a difficult situation for films from Peru, where they have tended to kind of do the global circuit first, sort of see how that goes, garner the awards and the attention and so on, and then come back to Peru with the awards, like, this must be a good film, or this is a good film, and now we want it here, and to kind of get the local attention. So I think it's sort of done the circuit in that way, which is the more closed environment that you spoke about. With this kind of democratization, people kind of pile in, but piling in with their support. And I think that's been really great. You've seen a great kind of kindness and support and encouragement. So I suppose that's sort of not so much the criticism, it's more of the, let's just do this. Let's see something different. Let's watch these things. Let's expose ourselves to the widest possible types of cinema. Let's link things. Let's send people links. Let's make sure people know about these festivals that are now online, and ensure that we're really opening up. So I think it's almost like the pre-criticism. It's like, let's just watch stuff first, before we even get into the kind of more formal criticism, and worry about that side of things. So that's been my reflection, really. There's been an explosion, and maybe that's me. I've just been like, wow, I can watch stuff. I don't have to be there. It's a relief, really. I can actually just kind of pile in and enjoy and consume a wider range of cinema, and that's because of people wanting you to do so and setting up the possibilities to do so, and the critics have been very much at the heart of that endeavour, for sure.
Yeah, I would like to say that seeing films in the internet could transform the consumption of film, thinking not only just in contemporary cinema, but it also made access to films from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, rare films. So, for example, in Brazil, for a young generation of film critics from the 2000, it was very difficult to see films like Jonas Mekas or Chantal Akerman, or the first films of Philippe Garrel, for example, his first films from the 60s. So the internet made a possibility to see these films, because these films were only screened in special screenings. So it transformed not only the values of contemporary cinema, but also this generation could revalue the history of cinema. So we were talking about canons, the film canons. So this generation of film critics and filmmakers could open his gallery of films beyond the canons. So they could form their own canons, you know. So I think the cybercinephilia was very important to film criticism, not just about contemporary cinema, but to propose a debate on the own history of cinema, of how the canons were made, under which circumstances some films were elected as canons, and who elected these films. So I remember it was a huge impact on my generation when we could see some other films that were not generally included in the film canons and the books we read about the history of cinema. So to have access to the films are very important to think about the history of cinema. So I think internet and film criticism are very important to shape our vision of what is really the histories of cinema.
Thanks, Marcelo. Steph has got a question. Steph, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, it's kind of like a double whammy, if that's okay, but I'll try and be quick because I know there's another question in the Q&A. So Marcelo, the examples, thanks for the panel, by the way, really interesting. The examples that you cited of the influence of film criticism on new generations of filmmakers were both in connection to the canon, which, obviously you were just been talking about. We also talked about it in the previous panel. So critics expand the canon, and that, therefore carries on and influences film directors. But you also mentioned that this new generation of film critics, you used a couple of terms. You mentioned that they have other ways of writing, and then you also said that they're using new methods. So I was just wondering if you could comment on what this new way of writing is, what these new methods are. And I'm wondering, does the new method, and this is the question for Sarah, does the new method have anything to do with producing video essays, for example? Deborah Shaw very kindly typed in the link, and I think quite a few of us have had a chance to nosy at the website, and it's fascinating, Sarah. And there is a section on video essays, and that's something that, I've been thinking a lot about, the presence of video essays in certain film cultures, and connected to film criticism, and as a new way of finding potential new audiences for our film criticism. And some cultures this seems to be very much enshrined within academic practice, and other places it isn't. So I'd just like to know more about the place of the video essay within new criticism in Peru. So sorry, it's a double whammy.
Marcelo, you go first.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie, for the question. So other ways of writing for the internet generation. I hope my English is not so bad, so I can explain it. I can express myself. But in newspaper, usually the writing is around the information, a kind of journalistic format that is related to information. And what is David Bordwell wrote a very, very good film about film criticism, that he talks about the rhetoric, a kind of argumentation. And I think the the newspaper, the mainstream journalists, they write about film criticism in a kind of a journalistic format. So in the internet, this new generation of film critics, they don't have established a pattern of writing. They can write big, small subjects, and they can have texts, more phenomenological texts. They can, for example, write in first person. They can tell about his or her own experience of watching these films. They can connect this film to many other relation to theater, dance, music, and to other circumstances, apart from objective description and analysis and information. I think this, for example, there are diaristic formats, or like first person, like essays, like film diaries, in such formats like blogs. For example, many critics did not create established website, but blogs, where they could develop more personal insights about cinema. So I think this is the other ways of writing about cinema.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, what he said basically translate to the Peruvian context. Thank you, Marcelo. I really think that this is coming through as a really important form for film criticism, but also as a particular pertinent form, as we know, for kind of understanding the art of cinema, experimental cinema, for kind of just using different forms to do that. And I think in particular, it's seen by Monica and her, the group of colleagues she's working with as a way of bringing forward a different sort of filmmaking as well. It's sort of that kind of interface between experimental filmmaking and film criticism. Experimental filmmaking, experimental film criticism, which is, I think, really exciting. It sort of really merges those there, which I think many scholars are also kind of working with. We've kind of, a lot of people have moved. I haven't, because I'm rubbish at that kind of thing. But from the kind of the writing towards the kind of more, let's bring the visual into our writing and make that a form of writing, which is really exciting. And that's what the online can do. And I think that, going back to our previous discussion, helps break down the canon, or our perceived idea of the canon, because we can then juxtapose a canonical text like the ones we were talking about earlier with texts that maybe have elements of them, images of them, but bring those in juxtaposition with each other in much more exciting ways. So yeah, I think it's the way to go. And I have to say, I'm a big proponent of the podcast, which I think is beautifully done across many of these arenas as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Question from Donna to Sarah. Has there been any backlash to the bilingualism or the prominence of English in Monica Delgado's desist? Does this represent a new hierarchy or prestige value in film criticism in Latin America?
It's a great question, Donna. Not that I know of. It is a blog that is very much Spanish, but with the English translation. So yes, there is prominence of English, but it's translated to English from the Spanish. So the Spanish is the prime version there. So not that I know of, but it could be. It's kind of something to keep an eye out for. But I think it's that nod to. It's a nod to difference. It's something that her predecessors, such as those from La Gran Ilusión and Hablemos de Cine, didn't do. It's a nod to something else. It's a nod to opening up. It's perhaps a nod to kind of democratization in a different form. Whether it becomes a new kind of prestige, who knows? I think that's often what does happen, doesn't it? Where you kind of become the new canon, the new way of seeing. So it's something to look out for.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So I think that just about brings us to time. I can see that Nuria's got a question as well, but I'm not quite sure how breaks are working. I know that we've got a break line for 2:15. So perhaps that's a question that can be asked during the break. Are people kind of generally hanging around on Zoom? I guess we'll see. But in any case, thanks very much to Sarah, Marcelo, to both of you for your really informative papers, and for your kind of enthusiasm and excitement about the lay of the land at the moment. It is exciting to see all the different kind of criticism that's going on and all the kind of creativity that that is being made in response to cinema, as well as kind of as the the bread and butter of cinematic production. So thanks very much to you both. The break starts now, and we're back at 2:30 with Fia as chair.